A young man sold all his belongings to pay for his sick brother's treatment. Days later, a stranger contacted him with a surprise that would change his life forever. The sound of the alarm broke the silence in the small room where Jake was sleeping. It was 5 in the morning, but for him, the day started long before the sun even considered rising. The apartment was in darkness, a reflection of the heavy burden he carried. Slowly he got up, feeling the exhaustion that had accumulated in his body. Every movement reminded him of the long work hours that barely kept him standing, but there was no other choice. He had to keep going. On the mattress lying on the floor, his younger brother Ethan was still asleep. His thin arms clung to the blankets as if they could protect him from the constant pain his frail body could no longer ignore. Ethan was only 16, but his life had changed radically in just a few months. What used to be energy and vitality was now weakness and fatigue. The degenerative illness that consumed him was progressing at a devastating pace, and Jake watched helplessly as his brother, who once dreamed of becoming a football player, now couldn't even get out of bed without help. Jake walked toward the kitchen, a small and cluttered space that reflected the chaos in their lives. He turned on the coffee maker, knowing that coffee was the only thing keeping him awake for the long day ahead. His routine no longer belonged to him. He had abandoned his studies and any hope of his own life since the accident that took his parents. That day, nearly a year ago, he remembered with painful precision. He had been in the middle of class when he got the call. His world fell apart in an instant. His parents had died in a head-on collision on their way back from visiting friends. The loss hit him like a train, but he had no time to grieve or process the void that had taken root in his heart. He had to immediately step into the role of protector and caregiver for Ethan. Ethan, already showing signs of illness, depended entirely on him, and although Jake wasn't prepared for this, he had no other option. He had become everything for his brother: mother, father, friend, nurse, provider. As the coffee brewed, Jake mentally reviewed his schedule: work at the warehouse from 6 in the morning until noon, then rush to the restaurant to cover the afternoon shift. Exhaustion consumed him, but beyond the physical fatigue, what crushed him most was the sense that it would never be enough. No matter how hard he worked, there was always a shortage of money. The medical bills kept coming, each one more expensive than the last, and the treatment Ethan needed was far more costly than they could ever afford. The healthcare system gave them no relief. The few government assistance programs they applied for had been denied over and over again, and each rejection was like a punch to the gut. He still remembered the last hospital visit, when they explained that the insurance wouldn't cover the experimental treatment that could give Ethan a chance to get better. Jake left that meeting with his soul shattered, feeling powerless against a system that seemed determined to sink them further. As he sipped his coffee, his eyes rested on the clock on the wall. It was a few minutes before 6 in the morning. It was time to wake Ethan, a moment Jake dreaded with all his heart. Every morning, waking his brother meant facing the harsh reality of how much had changed in such a short time. The boy who used to run around the house with a smile on his face now writhed in pain, just trying to stand up. Jake approached the mattress on the floor and gently called him, "Ethan, it's time to get up." Ethan opened his eyes slowly, his pupils dull, a reflection of the fatigue that the illness had imposed on him. Even so, he forced a smile for his older brother. "Is it time already?" he asked in a raspy voice. Jake nodded, bending down to help him sit up. Every movement from Ethan was a battle, a silent fight against a body that no longer responded as it once did. "Today I'll try to walk to the kitchen," Ethan said, as if the simple act of walking was an Olympic goal. Jake helped him carefully, trying to hide the lump in his throat as he watched his brother struggle with every tiny step. What was an everyday act for others was a colossal challenge for Ethan. As he guided him toward the kitchen, Jake couldn't help but think about the future. How much longer could this go on? He didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to give up. He would do anything for Ethan, no matter the cost. But deep down, he started to wonder how much longer he could bear the weight of this fight. The sound of the door closing echoed in the small, empty apartment. Jake had just left for his first shift of the day, leaving Ethan alone as he did every morning. His routine had become an automatic process, a cycle of exhaustion with no end in sight. The cold morning air barely managed to clear his mind, already clouded by fatigue. As he walked to the bus stop, his mind couldn't stop replaying the same questions that tormented him every day. How was he going to get more money? What else could he do? That afternoon, after finishing his grueling shift at the warehouse, Jake returned home, greeted by silence. Ethan was lying on the mattress, dozing, too weak to move. Seeing his brother always so tired and fragile broke his heart. Jake knew that no matter how much he worked, it would never be enough to cover the treatment his brother desperately needed. They had exhausted all the options for government aid, and the little assistance they did receive barely covered the essentials. Jake sat in a chair in the corner of the room, holding his head in his hands. The apartment that had once been a cozy home was now slowly emptying. The sofa, once a place for family gatherings, was gone. He had sold it last week. His parents' car, a living memory of family vacations, was also gone. It had been one of the first things he sold, though it pained him deeply. That car had been a symbol of the good times, a tangible reminder of the happiness they shared when his parents were still alive, but desperation had forced him to let it go, as if giving up those objects could give Ethan a chance at life. Yet even that sacrifice wasn't enough. The medical bills continued to pile up on the kitchen table, each one larger than the last. The idea of selling more things began to feel inevitable in his mind. Each time Jake sat in that chair, he looked at the few remaining items in the apartment. The dining table, the beds, some old appliances. Everything he still owned was on the verge of disappearing, one by one, in the hope of buying a little more time for his brother. "We can't keep going like this," he muttered softly, though Ethan couldn't hear him. Jake didn't know how much longer he could endure the situation. Watching his brother deteriorate was unbearable, and feeling like his efforts were powerless to stop Ethan's illness sent him spiraling further into despair every day. The next morning, when Ethan woke up, he noticed something different. His bed was gone. In its place, there was only the mattress directly on the floor, where he now slept. "Where's the bed?" Ethan asked, his weak voice a mix of surprise and sadness. Jake tried to sound nonchalant, as if it wasn't a big deal. "I sold it. You weren't using it much and we needed the money." Ethan stayed silent, understanding the sacrifice his brother was making, but feeling guilty for being the reason everything was disappearing. He clutched the sheets, the only things left that still reminded him of his old life. It felt like little by little they were losing everything, not just the furniture, but the memories, the life they once knew. "You didn't have to do it," Ethan whispered, staring at the floor. "Yes, I did," Jake replied firmly. "Don't worry about it. Everything will be fine." But deep down he knew that even he didn't believe that lie. Jake decided to sell the kitchen table that same week. It was a heavy, old piece of furniture, but full of memories. He remembered family meals, his parents' laughter, and how Ethan used to sit there in his soccer uniform, full of energy and dreams. But those days were gone. Now the table was covered in bills, a metaphor for the burden he was dragging along. With the table gone, the apartment felt even more desolate. As the furniture disappeared, the space grew colder, emptier, reflecting the loneliness Jake felt every time he left for work, leaving Ethan alone. He knew his brother was trying to be strong for him, but he could also see the sadness in Ethan's eyes whenever he noticed another piece of their life vanishing. The nights grew longer. Too tired to sleep, Jake would often lie awake, staring at the empty ceiling. He wondered how far he would have to go. What else could he sell? What more could he sacrifice for his brother? The apartment, once a refuge, was now a constant reminder of everything he had lost. Every time he looked around, he saw the empty spaces where the furniture used to be, as if those empty spaces also existed inside him. But what tore him apart most wasn't the loss of material things, it was the feeling of failure. He was supposed to be Ethan's protector, his savior, but each day he felt more defeated, unable to give his brother the life he deserved. That night, after working a double shift at the restaurant, Jake came home exhausted. When he walked in, Ethan was waiting on the mattress, eyes fixed on the door. "Jake, you can't keep selling everything," Ethan said, his voice filled with concern. Jake sat down next to him without saying a word. He knew his brother was right, but he had no other choice. The weight of responsibility was a burden he couldn't shrug off. "I do it for you, Ethan, because I love you." Jake spoke quietly, almost as if he was trying to convince himself that his sacrifices would one day be worth it. Ethan didn't respond right away, but he reached out and held his brother's hand tightly. Even though both knew that words couldn't change reality, that gesture was Ethan's way of saying he understood, that he was grateful, and that despite everything they would stick together. But deep down, Jake wondered how much longer he could keep going. He knew the time would soon come when there would be nothing left to sell. The sun was just beginning to filter through the window when Jake woke up that morning. The apartment was still wrapped in an unsettling quiet, only broken by the faint sound of Ethan's breathing from his mattress. Though the sun shone outside inside those walls, the darkness remained thick. Jake got up silently and, as usual, went to prepare breakfast. The fridge was nearly empty, with just a few eggs and some bread left. Jake managed with what little they had, but that morning, as he fried the eggs, he felt like he was running out of every possible resource: physical, emotional, and financial. In the background, a faint cough could be heard. Ethan was awake. The cough was a new symptom, something that had worsened over the last few weeks, and Jake could no longer ignore it. Ethan's illness was progressing faster than the doctors had predicted, and every day Jake felt more powerless against his brother's inevitable decline. "Breakfast is almost ready," Jake said, trying to sound more upbeat than he felt as he set the plates on the table. Ethan struggled to sit up on his mattress. Every movement seemed to cost him the world, as if his body was losing all the strength it once had. Jake helped him to the makeshift table, now without chairs since he had sold those too, and sat across from him. "Jake, you don't have to do all this," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. The exhaustion in his eyes was obvious, but what hurt the most was the guilt they reflected. "Yes, I do," Jake replied firmly. "You're my brother. I'm not going to let this disease win without a fight." Ethan gave a faint smile but said nothing more. He knew that as much as Jake tried to be strong, it was becoming harder for him to hide the pain he was feeling. That same morning, as Jake got ready to leave for work, Ethan sat there staring at his trembling hands. It was frustrating to see how his body betrayed him day after day, robbing him of the ability to do even the simplest things, like dressing himself or holding a glass. When Jake left, Ethan was alone again in the empty apartment. The walls seemed to close in on him more each day, crushing him with the reality of his illness. During the hours that Jake worked, Ethan usually lay in bed, battling not just physical pain but the weight of his guilt. He knew his brother was sacrificing everything for him, and the thought that Jake was destroying his own life to keep Ethan's afloat made him feel worse than any physical symptom. But that day things took a drastic turn. At noon, Ethan tried to get out of bed to go to the bathroom, but something in his body didn't respond as it should have. His legs gave out, and suddenly he felt a sharp pain in his chest. He tried to scream, but only a faint groan escaped before he collapsed to the floor. For what felt like an eternity, Ethan lay there on the cold floor of the apartment, feeling as if his body was no longer his own. When Jake came home that afternoon, the first thing he saw was Ethan on the floor, struggling to breathe. Panic flooded him. "Ethan, Ethan!" he yelled, rushing to him and lifting him carefully. His brother's body felt too light, more than it should for someone his age, and that made Jake feel even worse. Jake called 911 while trying to stay calm, but inside, a desperate voice screamed that time was running out. As they waited for the ambulance, he held Ethan in his arms, doing his best to stay strong. But in his eyes, Ethan could see the fear. For the first time, his older brother, his protector, was losing hope. The ambulance arrived quickly, and the paramedics immediately began attending to Ethan. They placed him on a stretcher and hooked him up to an oxygen machine. Jake followed closely, not letting go of his brother's hand for even a second. "He's getting worse, isn't he?" Ethan murmured weakly, looking up at Jake from the stretcher as the ambulance rushed them to the hospital. Jake couldn't lie to him, not this time. "We're going to get through this, Ethan, I promise." But even he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed what Jake had feared. Ethan's illness had progressed faster than expected. His heart and lungs were starting to fail, and the doctors said that if he didn't begin the experimental treatment soon, his brother might not survive much longer. Jake listened in silence, feeling the weight of those words pierce his chest like a dagger. But the reality was inescapable. The treatment cost far more than he could ever afford. Not with every job in the world, not by selling every last possession. It was an unreachable sum and time was running out. That night, when he returned to the empty apartment, Jake sat on the floor, leaning his back against the bare wall. Everything was disappearing around him, but what hurt the most was that he wasn't succeeding in saving his brother. Exhaustion and despair finally caught up to him, and for the first time in months, he let the tears flow freely down his face. As he cried in silence, Jake knew that something had to change, but he didn't know how. He only knew he couldn't give up, not while Ethan needed him. The hospital was filled with the usual bustle, doctors and nurses hurrying back and forth, the constant hum of machines monitoring patients' lives, and the soft, worried murmurs of families. In the midst of this controlled chaos, Dr. Rachel Mitchell walked down the halls, her mind focused on one thing: the Smith brothers. Rachel had met Jake and Ethan months ago when Ethan first came to the hospital with mild symptoms. Since then, she had closely followed their case, her heart heavy each time she saw the young man's unstoppable deterioration. She had treated many patients in her career, but something about the Smith brothers' situation touched her in a special way. Rachel couldn't help but remember her own story. Her mother had passed away years ago from a disease that, like Ethan's, had dragged them through a long and painful path of failed treatments and crushed hopes. She had seen firsthand how the healthcare system, with its restrictions and bureaucracies, crushed families who just wanted to save their loved ones. From that moment on, she had promised to do everything she could to make sure others didn't go through what she had. As she reviewed the reports from Ethan's latest hospitalization, Rachel felt that something had to change. She knew Jake was on the brink of collapse, both emotionally and financially. She saw it in his tired eyes every time he came to the hospital, in the way he avoided conversations about treatment costs. Rachel wanted to help, but she knew the hospital's resources were limited. She had already tried enrolling Ethan in several medical assistance programs, but all had been denied due to strict regulations. "I can't let this go on," she muttered to herself as she closed Ethan's medical file. That afternoon, Rachel locked herself in her office. She knew there had to be a solution, but it wouldn't be easy. She remembered something she had heard years ago when she first started working at the hospital. A man named Charles Harris had been an important benefactor in the past, funding expensive treatments for patients who couldn't afford them. However, Charles had disappeared from public life after a personal tragedy. No one at the hospital knew exactly what had happened, but Rachel recalled hearing whispers about the death of his son. Sitting at her desk, Rachel searched for all the information she could find on Charles Harris. He had once been known for his generosity, but after losing his son in a car accident, he had shut the world out. He had stopped funding treatments and retreated to live on a farm far from the city. However, Rachel had a feeling that this man was Ethan and Jake's only hope. "I have to try," she whispered to herself, as she began writing a letter to Charles. In the letter, Rachel detailed the Smith brothers' situation, how Jake had sacrificed everything to save his brother, how the illness had progressed faster than expected, and how the healthcare system had left them with no way out. Rachel didn't just want Charles to understand the urgency of the case. She also hoped to touch a sensitive chord in him, connecting the brother's story to his own experience of loss. As she wrote, emotions overwhelmed her. She knew Charles had been suffering since the death of his son, and although she didn't know him personally, she could imagine the depth of that pain. For that reason, she also included a part of her own story in the letter, telling how she had lost her mother and how, since then, it had been her mission to help families facing similar situations. When she finished writing, Rachel sat back and stared at the paper. She knew the chances of getting a response were slim. Charles had been isolated for years and had rejected many previous attempts at contact. But she couldn't give up without trying. Jake and Ethan needed a chance, and if anyone could offer it, it was him. With the letter in hand, Rachel reached out to one of her contacts at the hospital, someone who had worked closely with Charles in the past. She asked for help to ensure the letter reached the right hands. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she trusted that her story, along with the Smith brothers, could touch the heart of a man who had dedicated his life to helping others before withdrawing. "Are you sure about this, Rachel?" her contact asked, knowing how reclusive Charles had become. "I don't have any other choice," she replied with determination. "If I don't try, I'm failing Ethan and Jake." That night, Rachel left the hospital with a mix of hope and fear. She knew she had done the right thing, but the uncertainty of Charles's response kept her on edge. As she walked to her car, she glanced up at the hospital windows, wondering if soon there would be a positive answer for the Smith brothers. She felt time was running out, but she also knew that sometimes fate has unexpected ways of intervening. The next day, Rachel returned to her usual routine at the hospital, but now with a nervous energy she couldn't shake off. Every time her phone rang, her heart raced, hoping it was a response from Charles. Yet the hours passed, and there was no news. Meanwhile, Jake continued with his daily struggle. He had no idea of the efforts Rachel was making on their behalf. To him, reality remained the same, working to the point of exhaustion and watching his brother deteriorate a little more each day. That afternoon, after coming home from his shift at the restaurant, Jake sat beside Ethan's bed, holding his hand. "I have to do more," Jake whispered, more to himself than to Ethan. "You're doing everything you can, Jake," Ethan murmured, trying to smile, though his weakness was apparent. But for Jake, that wasn't enough. He felt as though, despite all his efforts, he was failing, that no matter how hard he tried, Ethan's illness continued its relentless march. What Jake didn't know was that at that very moment, Rachel's letter was in the hands of someone who could change their lives forever. Charles Harris sat on the porch of his estate, gazing out at the horizon. The hills surrounding his property stretched like a golden and green blanket under the setting sun, but Charles barely noticed the landscape around him. His eyes were lost, immersed in memories that never seemed to stray far from his mind. Since his son's death, every day had been a repetition of uncomfortable silences, an empty routine that kept him disconnected from the outside world. The sealed envelope resting on the table in front of him seemed out of place in that setting. Charles had received it that very morning, delivered by one of his old contacts from the hospital. He knew it wasn't just any letter. Not many people dared to contact him directly. Since he had stepped away from public life, he had done everything he could to avoid such requests. But something in the man's expression when he handed it to him, and in the carefully chosen words that described its content, had made him pause. Charles sighed deeply before picking up the envelope. He still wasn't sure if he wanted to open it. He knew that whatever was written inside would probably remind him of everything he had been running from for years. But his curiosity got the better of him, and before he knew it, he had broken the seal and started to read. The letter was written with a warmth and sincerity he hadn't expected. Rachel Mitchell, the doctor who had signed it, didn't just describe the desperate situation of the Smith brothers. She also shared part of her own story. There was something deeply human in her words, something Charles hadn't felt in a long time. The life of Jake, as Rachel told it, resonated within him in an unsettling way. The sacrifice, the pain, and the constant struggle of a brother who had given everything to save his loved one reminded him of himself and what he had lost. As he read, memories of his own son, Santiago, became more vivid than ever. Charles had done everything he could to save his son when he fell ill years ago, but not even all the money in the world could change the course of events. Santiago's death had plunged Charles into a darkness he had never emerged from. He had closed all the doors to his public life, stopped helping others, and isolated himself on this estate, searching for a peace he never found. But now, as he read about Jake's sacrifices and Ethan's desperate fight, something stirred inside him. It was as though Rachel's words had awakened a part of him that had been dormant for years, the part that used to believe in helping others, in using his resources to make a difference in the lives of those who didn't have the same opportunities. Charles closed the letter and sat in silence for a moment, processing what he had read. Slowly, he stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the hills in the distance. The cool breeze brushed against his face, but he barely noticed it. His mind was racing, torn between the impulse to help and the fear of reopening the wounds that had destroyed him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Charles made a decision. He couldn't ignore the Smith brothers' situation. He couldn't keep hiding from life when someone needed desperately what he had to offer. It was time to confront the pain he had been avoiding for so long. The next day, Charles found himself sitting at his desk, holding the phone in his hand. He hadn't made a call like this in years, but he knew Rachel Mitchell deserved a response. He dialed the number on the letter and waited. Each ring reminded him that he was taking a step from which there would be no return. Finally, Rachel's voice came through the other end of the line. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Charles Harris," he said with a voice firmer than he felt. "I've received your letter." There was a brief pause, as if Rachel was processing what she had just heard. It had been so long since anyone had managed to reach Charles that for a second she didn't know how to react. "Mr. Harris, thank you for calling. This means so much to me, to them." Her voice held a tone of relief and contained emotion. Charles wasn't a man of many words, and that day was no exception. After a brief conversation, they agreed to meet at the hospital so he could learn more about the Smith brothers. Rachel could hardly believe that Charles had actually accepted the invitation, but something in his voice gave her hope that he was willing to do something, to get involved. 2 days later, Charles made his way to the hospital. The atmosphere there was very different from the calm of his estate. The bustling hallways, filled with doctors and patients, made him feel slightly uncomfortable, but at the same time they awakened memories of his past life when he frequented these places to help those in need. Rachel greeted him at the entrance. She was a young woman, but her eyes showed the experience and weariness of someone who had seen too many tragedies. She led him to her office and showed him the files on Ethan and Jake. As Charles read the medical reports and listened to more details about their situation, something inside him broke. The effort and dedication Jake had put into saving his brother reminded him of his own lost battle with Santiago. "How much time does he have without the treatment?" Charles asked, his voice low but steady. Rachel hesitated before answering. "Not much. His body is failing. Without the experimental treatment, Ethan might not make it to the next month." Charles nodded slowly. He knew what he had to do, but the decision tore him apart inside. It felt like he was reliving the tragedy of his son, but at the same time he knew he couldn't just stand by. He had come too far to turn his back now. "I want to meet them," he finally said, looking at Rachel with renewed determination. Emily Harris had grown used to the emotional distance her father had maintained over the past few years. After Santiago's death, Charles had changed completely. The loving, dedicated man she once knew had disappeared, replaced by someone consumed by guilt and grief. Though Charles had adopted her when she was a child, Emily had always felt like she lived in Santiago's shadow, Charles's biological son. And while he had been a good father in many ways, they had never managed to connect deeply. When Emily found out that Charles had received a letter from a doctor asking for help for 2 brothers, something stirred inside her, and not in a positive way. The idea that her father was coming out of his reclusion to help complete strangers filled her with a mix of anger and sadness. How could he, who barely spoke to her and lived locked away in his grief, be willing to intervene in the lives of others while their relationship remained broken? That afternoon, Emily drove to Charles's estate, determined to confront him. When she arrived, she found him in his study, looking over some documents she couldn't make out. There was a palpable coldness in the air, as there always was when they saw each other. Charles glanced up at her as she entered, but said nothing. He just waited in silence. "I know what you're doing," Emily said bluntly, crossing her arms. Charles sighed. He knew this conversation was inevitable. He had seen the discomfort in Emily's eyes every time the Smith brothers were mentioned in their brief talks. "I'm not going to argue with you, Emily," he responded, his tone weary. "There are people who need help, and I can give it." Emily felt a lump in her throat. For years she had fought to get her father's attention, to reclaim something of the man he used to be before the tragedy. And now he was willing to pour his energy into 2 people whose names he hadn't even known before receiving that letter. "What about me?" she asked with a mix of pain and resentment. "For years, I've been here, waiting for you to see me, to help me. But instead, you keep going back to what you lost." Charles looked at her in silence, searching for the right words. He knew Emily was partly right, but the weight of the grief he had carried for so long had kept him blind to what was happening around him. "Emily," he began, his tone softer now, I never wanted you to feel that way. But there are things I can't fix. The past can't be changed. What I lost, what we both lost." He paused, unable to continue for a moment. "I can't bring Santiago back, and I know that's driven us apart. But what I want to do for these kids isn't for them, it's for me. It's my way of trying to redeem myself." Charles's words hit Emily like a cold shock. She understood that her father was still carrying the weight of guilt, but she couldn't help feeling like she was being sidelined again. Still, something in the sincerity of his voice made her lower her guard a little. "Why them?" she asked, her tone calmer now. "What is it about those brothers that makes you think helping them is what you need?" Charles turned to look out the window, toward the fields surrounding the estate, as if searching the landscape for the answer he so desperately needed. "Because I see in them what I couldn't do for Santiago. I see a brother sacrificing everything to save the other, and I know what it's like to want to do that and fail." Emily pressed her lips together, feeling the pain in her father's voice. She had spent years believing that Charles simply didn't see her, but now she began to understand that, deep down, he was as lost as she was, searching for a way to atone for his own ghosts. Still, that didn't change the fact that their relationship remained broken, and helping the Smith brothers wouldn't fix that. "I get that you want to help them," she finally replied, her tone less harsh. "But have you ever thought about helping me? About what we could have done together if you hadn't been so distant?" Charles remained silent, the guilt and sadness in his eyes unmistakably. But he didn't know how to answer her question. He knew he had failed as a father to Emily in more ways than he could count, but he also understood that he couldn't easily mend the past. "I'm sorry, Emily, I know I've failed you, but let me do this. Let me try to help these kids. Maybe in the process, I can find a way to be more present for you too." Emily slowly nodded, feeling that, for the first time in years, her father was speaking to her with a level of honesty he had never shown before. It wasn't going to be easy to overcome the barriers they had built between them, but at least now she understood better where Charles's desire to get involved with the Smith brothers came from. "Fine," she said, taking a step back. "If you think this will help, go ahead. But don't forget that I'm still here." Charles nodded with a slight sad smile. He knew that their relationship was far from being fixed, but that conversation was a first step. That same afternoon, Emily decided to learn more about the Smith brothers. She wanted to understand why her father felt so drawn to them. Digging through the hospital records, she found Ethan's medical reports and the details of Jake's relentless struggle. What she read was shocking. Jake's sacrifices, his absolute dedication to his brother, and the desperate fight to stay afloat resonated with her in a way she hadn't expected. Emily, who had always felt that her father never prioritized her, began to see something admirable in Jake, someone willing to give everything for love. For the first time, Emily's resistance to her father's decision began to crumble. She now understood that the Smith brothers weren't just strangers. They were people facing a tragedy she, too, knew all too well. The sound of hospital machines was the only thing breaking the uncomfortable silence in Ethan's room. Jake sat by his brother's bedside, his gaze distant. He had spent so many hours in that chair that he no longer felt his legs. Ethan was sleeping deeply, exhausted after a series of tests the doctors had run that morning. Every time Jake saw his brother hooked up to the monitors, his heart broke a little more. He had reached a point where he didn't know how much more he could take. He worked tirelessly, sold everything he owned, and yet he felt it was a losing battle. The night before, after speaking with the doctors, he had finally accepted that the treatment Ethan needed was out of reach. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how many belongings he sold, it wouldn't be enough. The treatment was their last hope. But the money made it impossible. Jake stood up from the chair and stepped into the hallway, feeling the tightness in his chest. He needed a moment to breathe, even if just for a bit of fresh air. As he walked toward the hospital exit, he didn't know that later that day, he would receive a visit that would change the course of their lives. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the hospital, Charles Harris was on his way to the room where they were expecting him. It was his first time back in a hospital in years. The memories hit him hard as he walked through the corridors. The sound of machines, the murmur of doctors, the bright hospital lights. Everything reminded him of the endless visits when Santiago was ill and how, despite all the money he had spent, he hadn't been able to save him. But now he was here for the Smith brothers. Since reading Rachel's letter and hearing more about Jake and Ethan's situation, Charles hadn't been able to get them out of his mind. He knew what it was like to lose a son, and he didn't want Jake to go through the same thing with his brother. If he could do something to help, he had to try. Rachel was waiting for him at the door to the room. Her expression was a mix of relief and gratitude. She had feared that Charles might change his mind at the last moment, but seeing him there, in person, gave her the certainty that there might be a chance to save Ethan after all. "Mr. Harris, thank you for coming," Rachel said, shaking his hand. Charles nodded, a serious gesture, but said nothing. He felt uncomfortable being back in a place so filled with pain, but he knew it was the right thing to do. Rachel guided him to the room where Ethan was resting. When they entered, Ethan was asleep, his breathing soft, but the exhaustion evident on his face. Charles paused at the doorway, watching the young man fighting for his life. There was something devastating about the frailty of his body, the way his thin arms and legs disappeared under the hospital sheets. "Jake stepped out for some air. He'll be back in a few minutes," Rachel whispered softly. "You can wait here if you'd like." Charles nodded again, but didn't move closer to the bed. His mind flooded with memories of Santiago. He couldn't help but see his own son in Ethan's place, and the thought pierced him like a dagger. He remembered the long nights beside Santiago's bed, the empty promises from doctors, and the moment when everything ended. He forced himself to focus on the present. Ethan still had a chance, and he could help. A few minutes later, Jake entered the room. At first, he didn't notice Charles. He was so used to doctors and nurses coming in and out that he paid little attention. But when he looked up and saw the unfamiliar man standing in the corner, his expression immediately changed. There was something unsettling about Charles's presence. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice filled with suspicion and confusion. Rachel quickly intervened, trying to ease the tension. "Jake, this is Charles Harris. He's here to see how we can help Ethan." Jake frowned. Help. After everything he'd been through, skepticism had become his natural defense. He was tired of empty promises and feeling like he was failing. "Why?" was all Jake could manage to say, his voice more bitter than he intended. Charles took a step forward, but kept a respectful distance, understanding the delicacy of the moment. "I read your story," Charles began, his voice firm but compassionate, "and I know what it feels like to be where you are now, feeling like the world is crashing down on you with no way out. I've been there, and I don't want you to go through what I did." Jake stared at him, saying nothing. He didn't understand why a man he didn't know wanted to help him. Over the past few months, he had learned not to trust people. He had fought alone for so long that the idea of someone doing something for him and his brother felt unreal. "I know this isn't easy to accept," Charles continued. "I've lost someone too, my son. I fought as hard as you're fighting now and I failed. But you don't have to. I can help you get the treatment for Ethan." Charles's words hung in the air for a moment, and Jake felt something inside him give way. It was as if an invisible barrier he had built around himself began to crumble. But accepting that help meant admitting he couldn't do it alone. And that was Jake's greatest fear. "Why would you do that?" he finally asked, his voice broken by doubt and exhaustion. "You don't know me. You don't know my brother. Why do you care?" Charles looked him in the eye with an intensity that surprised Jake. "Because if I can save your brother, maybe I can find some peace with what I lost. I can't change the past, but I can do something for Ethan's future." Silence filled the room again. Jake didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to refuse the offer, to keep bearing the burden alone, but the other part, the tired, desperate part, knew this might be the only chance to save his brother. Finally, Jake nodded, his eyes filling with tears he could no longer hold back. "If you can help him, then please do it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Charles stepped forward, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing the right thing. He couldn't bring his son back, but he could save someone else. Maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Jake could hardly believe what had just happened. As he watched Charles leave the room with a promise that could change his brother's life, he stood frozen, feeling a swirl of relief, doubt, and fear. After months of solitary struggle, a man he didn't know had just offered him a chance, something that had seemed impossible just days before. But accepting help, especially from a stranger, didn't come easily to him. Jake sank into the chair next to Ethan's bed, watching his brother breathe softly, still asleep. The sound of the heart monitor was a constant reminder of how fragile their situation was, but for the first time in a long while, a spark of hope began to ignite in his chest. The door to the room opened quietly, and Rachel entered, her expression calm yet watchful. "How do you feel?" she asked, approaching slowly. Jake sighed, running his hands over his face, trying to clear the confusion he felt. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's too much. After everything we've been through, for someone to come along and offer exactly what we need." He trailed off, searching for the words. "I don't know if it's real. I don't know if I can trust that this will actually happen." Rachel sat beside him, showing the same understanding she'd had since she first met the brothers. She knew that, after so much suffering, accepting help wasn't just about need, it was about pride and resilience too. "It's normal to feel that way," she said softly. "You've been through so much, Jake. You've carried more than anyone should, and you haven't had anyone to help you. But sometimes, accepting that you can't do it all alone isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength." Jake looked at her, feeling that her words made sense, though the weight of his doubts still pressed down on him. "I know," he sighed, "but for so long I've felt like failing Ethan would be the worst thing that could happen to me. I've done everything I could to protect him, to save him, but now I have to admit that I can't do any more. And that kills me." Rachel looked at him with empathy, understanding the conflict he was going through. She had seen so many families break under the weight of guilt, especially when their loved ones depended on them to survive. But she also knew that Jake wasn't failing Ethan. He was doing the best he could in an impossible situation. "You've done more than anyone could," she assured him, "and now someone else is willing to continue that fight with you. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let others help you. This doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're willing to do whatever it takes to save him." Rachel's words resonated with Jake. As much as he wanted to keep fighting on his own, he knew in his heart that he had reached his limit. And if that meant accepting Charles's help, he would have to do it, for Ethan's sake. The days that followed passed quickly. The paperwork to start Ethan on the experimental treatment was in motion, and Jake couldn't help but feel strange watching everything move forward without the usual obstacles he had grown accustomed to. He had spent so long battling every bill, every form, every rejection, that now the feeling that something was working out left him disoriented. Charles visited the hospital several times during those days, keeping a respectful distance but always present. He knew his relationship with Jake was still fragile and didn't want to push him. But each time he saw the brothers, something inside him softened. Jake's determination to save Ethan, the unbreakable bond between them, reminded him of his own relationship with Santiago. And while Charles knew he couldn't change what had happened to his son, helping these young men felt like a step toward his own redemption. One day, as Charles stood by the door of Ethan's room, watching from a distance, Jake approached him. They had exchanged few words since their first meeting, but that day, something in Jake had shifted. He had accepted Charles's help, but it was still difficult to process what that meant. "I don't know how to thank you for what you're doing," Jake said, breaking the silence. Charles looked at him with a slight but sincere smile. "You don't have to thank me," Charles replied, his voice steady. "I'm doing this because I want to, not because I expect gratitude. Besides, I think I'm helping myself as much as I'm helping you." Jake nodded, feeling the honesty in Charles's words, which surprised him. He had assumed that someone like Charles, with so much money and power, would be disconnected from real problems. But the more they spoke, the more Jake realized that this man was also broken inside, battling his own demons. "It's hard to accept help," Jake admitted. "I always thought I had to do everything alone for my brother." Charles nodded, understanding that internal struggle perfectly. "I thought the same once. I wanted to save my son by myself. But what I've learned is that we can't always do it alone. It's not a sign of failure. Sometimes we need others to help carry the weight. Jake looked over at Ethan's bed, watching his brother sleep. He knew Charles was right, but he also knew that this path wouldn't be easy. Accepting help meant facing the fact that he wasn't invincible, that there were limits to what he could do. "I'll do everything I can for Ethan," Jake finally said, "but now I understand that I don't have to do it alone." Charles looked at him with respect, sensing that Jake had learned a lesson that had taken him years to grasp. Jake was strong, not just because he fought for his brother, but because he had learned to accept that he couldn't fight alone. That day, Charles left the hospital with a strange sense of peace, something he hadn't felt since Santiago's death. As he walked toward his car, he knew he had made the right decision. Helping Jake and Ethan wasn't just an act of charity, it was a step toward his own healing. Jake returned to Ethan's room, feeling lighter than he had in months. There was still a long road ahead, and Ethan's treatment wasn't an immediate solution. But for the first time in a long while, Jake knew he wasn't alone in this fight. He had his brother, Rachel, and in a way he had never expected, Charles. And that, he thought as he sat next to Ethan's bed, was more than he had had in a long time. Emily watched her father with a mix of curiosity and concern. Since Charles decided to help the Smith brothers, something in him had changed. He was more open, more engaged, and although Emily was still grappling with the resentment she had harbored for years, she couldn't deny that something in her father was healing. The reports on Ethan's health were encouraging, and Emily began following the situation closely. At first, it was out of mere curiosity. She wanted to understand what drew her father so strongly to these brothers, why he was willing to get involved in a way he hadn't with her. But the more she learned about Jake and Ethan, the more she realized that the situation was far deeper than she had imagined. One afternoon, after spending the entire day working at the family businesses, Emily decided to visit the hospital for the first time. She didn't mention it to Charles or anyone else because she wasn't sure what she expected to find. But something about the story kept pulling her in, even if reluctantly. When she arrived, Emily paused in front of the hospital entrance, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. She walked down the hallways, feeling a mix of discomfort and curiosity. Eventually, she found Ethan's room, where she saw him through the slightly open door. The young man was sitting up in bed with Jake beside him, speaking quietly. They seemed calm, as if their time in the hospital was just another step in their battle. Emily stood there watching the two brothers from the doorway. Jake, though visibly exhausted, looked more at ease than in the photos she had seen, and Ethan, though his body still bore the marks of pain and illness, smiled as he talked with his brother. There was a connection between them that Emily couldn't ignore, a bond forged through sacrifice and unconditional love, something she hadn't experienced in the same way. "Who are you?" a voice behind her asked, breaking the silence. Emily turned quickly and found herself face to face with Jake. He had stepped into the hallway and was looking at her with a mix of curiosity and caution. She noticed the same distrust in his eyes that she had seen in her own reflection so many times. "I'm Emily Harris," she replied, trying to keep her tone calm. "I'm Charles's daughter." Jake was silent for a moment, studying her as if trying to decipher her intentions. Finally, he nodded and gestured for her to come inside. "Come in, don't just stand at the door." Emily followed him into the room, unsure of what she expected to find. As she approached Ethan's bed, he looked at her with a weak but genuine smile. "Hello?" Ethan said, his voice soft but kind. "My brother has told me about you." Emily smiled back, though she felt slightly out of place. She wasn't used to this kind of interaction. Her life had been filled with social events, business meetings, and people who hid their emotions behind masks of courtesy. But here, in this small hospital room, everything was straightforward, real. There were no masks, just a constant struggle to survive. "It's nice to meet you," Emily replied, not entirely sure what else to say. "I've heard a lot about you too." Jake sat in the chair beside the bed, watching Emily as she remained standing. The silence in the room became more noticeable, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if everyone was trying to understand each other's presence without rushing to fill the space with unnecessary words. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "I guess you're here to make sure your father isn't doing something impulsive, right?" he said, with a tone that mixed honesty and a bit of irony. Emily looked at him, surprised by his frankness, but also grateful that he wasn't trying to sugarcoat the situation. At first, yes, she admitted without hesitation, but now I'm not so sure why I'm here. Jake nodded, as if understanding what Emily was feeling. There was something in his eyes that reflected an internal battle similar to the one he had been fighting for so long. I know what it's like to fight alone, Jake said, his voice full of sincerity. For a long time I thought I had to do everything by myself, for my brother, that I couldn't rely on anyone else. And when your father showed up, I didn't know if I could trust him, or anyone really. But you know what? Sometimes accepting that we need others is the only way to keep going. Jake's words struck a chord with Emily in a way she hadn't expected. She had spent so much time harboring resentment toward her father, toward the life she had been dealt, that she had never allowed herself to think about what it meant to truly rely on others or to accept that she needed help. She had always believed that she was stronger by handling everything on her own, but now, seeing the connection between Jake and Ethan, something inside her began to shift. Ethan, who had been quietly observing the interaction, finally spoke. My brother is the most stubborn of them all, but I think he's learning to let others help him. Maybe you should try it too. Ethan's light-hearted words paired with his calm tone disarmed Emily. She chuckled softly, feeling a small part of the tension she had been carrying start to dissolve. Maybe you're right, she replied, smiling sincerely for the first time in a long time. From that day on, Emily began visiting the hospital more frequently. At first, she went just to observe Ethan and Jake from a distance, as if she didn't want to get too involved. But little by little, her walls came down. She felt increasingly connected to the brothers' struggle, particularly to Jake's strength. She admired his determination and sacrifice, but she also saw a vulnerability in him that mirrored her own. Over time, Emily and Jake started talking more. Initially, the conversations were superficial, but soon they became deeper. They shared their stories, their fears, and the burdens they had carried for so long. Emily, who had always kept her emotions guarded, was surprised to find how easy it was to talk to Jake. He understood her in a way few others did. For Jake, Emily became something unexpected, a person who didn't judge his decisions, but understood them. She wasn't there to fix his problems or offer easy solutions. She was simply there, listening and sharing her own pain. The rhythmic sound of the heart monitor became almost comforting, a constant reminder that Ethan was still fighting. Each day that passed, his health seemed to improve just a little more. His breathing, once weak and labored, was now steadier, and though his movements were still slow and fatigued, there was a spark in his eyes that Jake hadn't seen in a long time. The doctors, led by Dr. Rachel Mitchell, began showing signs of optimism. The experimental treatment Charles had funded was working, and though they knew the road ahead was long, the early signs were encouraging. Jake spent most of his time by Ethan's bedside, helping him eat, get up, and take small steps around the hospital room. Every movement Ethan made was a small victory, and Jake couldn't help but smile each time his brother managed another step without help. I made it to the window today without falling on you, Ethan joked one day, a mischievous grin on his face. For the first time in weeks, Jake laughed, a sound that felt strange but also comforting. At this rate, you'll be running marathons soon, Jake said, helping him back to bed. Though, of course, you'll have to let me win at least once. Ethan laughed too, but there was a deeper look in his eyes. Despite the physical improvement, they both knew the fight wasn't over. The illness was still unpredictable, and while the progress was encouraging, no one knew if the treatment would remain effective in the long run. Charles continued to visit the brothers regularly, always from a respectful distance. Though he had been the driving force behind this medical miracle, he still wrestled with his own demons. Every time he saw Ethan improve, he felt proud of having contributed, but he couldn't shake the thought of Santiago. What would have happened if he had found a solution for his son in time? That question haunted him like a shadow, and though helping the Smith brothers made him feel useful, it also stirred up the pain of his loss. One day, as Charles stood in the doorway watching the brothers talk, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Emily, who had spotted him from the hallway. "Why don't you go in?" she asked softly. Charles sighed and shook his head. It's better not to. This is their moment, not mine. Emily looked at him with compassion, understanding her father's internal struggle more clearly than ever before. Though she had resented his emotional distance for years, she now began to see the depth of his pain. Charles didn't keep his distance because he didn't care. He was paralyzed by the fear of reliving his loss. "Dad," Emily said, using a tone she hadn't used in a long time, "what you're doing for them is making a difference. You don't need to stay in the shadows. You're not responsible for what happened with Santiago, but this is something you can do now, and you're doing it well." Charles looked at her for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. Emily's words were more profound than she probably realized. He knew she had also suffered because of the distance he had put between them, but hearing her say it so directly made him feel something different. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel something other than guilt. "Thank you," he finally said, his tone soft but genuine. Meanwhile, the relationship between Jake and Emily continued to grow stronger. What started as occasional conversations in the hospital room had now become something closer. Each time Emily visited, they spent more time talking, sharing parts of their lives that they had once kept silent. Emily, who had always kept an emotional shield up, began to open up to Jake in a way she hadn't expected. She told him about her childhood, about living in the shadow of Santiago, and how she had struggled to find her own place in the world without feeling like she was constantly competing with her brother's memory. Jake listened intently, never judging, something she deeply appreciated. In return, Jake shared his own fears and insecurities, admitting that, as much as he wanted to be Ethan's protector, there were moments when he felt like he was failing. Emily understood him, perhaps better than anyone. Both knew what it was like to carry a burden that seemed impossible to bear. "Sometimes I feel like I've spent so much time taking care of Ethan that I've forgotten who I am," Jake admitted one afternoon as they walked down the hospital hallway. Emily looked at him, understanding the feeling all too well. "It's easy to lose yourself when all you do is fight for others, but you haven't lost yourself, Jake. You're stronger than you think, and what you're doing for your brother, that defines you far more than anything else." Jake looked at her, feeling a deep connection with Emily that went beyond simple friendship. There was something about her, her hidden strength, her quiet understanding, that made him feel seen, perhaps for the first time in a long while. Days later, the doctors decided that Ethan was stable enough to take a walk in the hospital gardens. It was the first time in weeks that Ethan would leave his room, and both he and Jake were excited for the change of scenery. As they finally stepped outside, Ethan leaned on a cane, but he looked much stronger than before. Jake walked beside him, unable to hide his smile. Emily and Charles followed closely behind, watching with a mix of pride and relief. "This feels strange," Ethan said, glancing around. "I haven't been outside in so long that I almost forgot what it's like to breathe fresh air." Jake chuckled, happy to see his brother enjoying the moment. "Let's make the most of it then, and when we get out of here, we'll do all the things we haven't been able to." Ethan smiled, though he knew there was still a long road ahead. While things were improving, he couldn't help but remember the challenges that still lay in front of them. Emily approached them, joining the conversation. "I think we should plan a big outing once all of this is over. I'll take care of the food, but I can't promise anything too fancy." Ethan laughed, and for a moment everything felt normal, as if the hospital, the machines, and the treatments were just a distant nightmare. Charles watched the scene from a distance, feeling strangely content. Seeing Ethan walk and witnessing his daughter connect with Jake gave him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in years, it felt like the weight of his own pain was starting to lift. The morning sun filtered through the hospital windows, filling Ethan's room with a warm light that made everything seem a bit more hopeful. It had been a month since the experimental treatment began showing real results. Ethan, who had once struggled just to get out of bed, was now walking slowly down the hospital corridors, leaning on a cane but with a renewed energy. Though his recovery was slow, the progress was undeniable. Jake watched him with a mix of pride and relief. The months had been filled with relentless battles, and though they couldn't claim victory yet, he felt that for the first time in a while, the burden was lightening. His relationship with Ethan, always strong, had deepened even further through this journey. Every small step forward for his brother was a shared triumph. But as Jake focused on Ethan's recovery, something else had begun to develop in his life. His connection with Emily. Their long conversations in the hospital halls had grown deeper with time. Emily understood him in a way no one else had before. They shared a bond that went beyond empathy, and with each passing day, Jake felt that connection grow stronger. One afternoon, after another round of exercises with Ethan, Emily joined them in the hospital cafe. Jake watched as she spoke with his brother, laughing and joking in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. Despite everything Ethan had been through, he seemed lighter, more cheerful, and much of that was thanks to Emily, who had gone from a distant observer to someone who truly cared for them. When Ethan returned to his room to rest, Emily and Jake remained in the cafe, sharing a cup of coffee. There was a comfortable silence between them, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled with words. "Ethan's improving so much," Emily finally said, breaking the silence. "It's incredible to see him like this after everything he's been through." Jake nodded, though he knew there was still a long fight ahead. Still, he couldn't help but feel grateful for everything that had happened in recent months, including the unexpected relationship he had formed with Emily. "It really is," he replied, "and I know part of that is because of you. You've been here, supporting us. I don't know how to thank you for everything." Emily looked at him, smiling gently. "You don't need to thank me for anything, Jake. You and Ethan have done all the hard work. I'm just here." Jake took a sip of his coffee, knowing her words carried more weight than they appeared to. He was grateful for her presence, not just for her support, but because she had filled a void in his life he hadn't realized was there. With her, he felt he could let his guard down, something he hadn't done in a long time. "Emily," he began, hesitating for a moment, "I don't know what I would have done without you through all of this. You've been more than a friend. You've been important to me." Emily met his gaze, understanding what he was trying to say, but also feeling the same mix of emotions within herself. For weeks, she had noticed how her relationship with Jake was evolving. She admired him for his strength, but also for his vulnerability, for his ability to keep moving forward, despite all the difficulties. And in that process, she had developed deeper feelings than she had expected. "You're important to me too, Jake," she replied, sincerity in every word. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, knowing that their lives had changed forever. Neither of them had planned for this turn in their paths, but what they had found in each other was something unexpected and real. Meanwhile, Charles sat in his office, reviewing some documents. Over the past few weeks, he had closely monitored Ethan's treatment, but he had also begun reflecting on the future. He knew that his relationship with Emily had significantly improved since he started helping the Smith brothers, but he also knew there were still wounds to heal between them. Charles wondered what would come next for him. The connection he had developed with the brothers had made him reconsider many things in his life. For years, he had lived isolated from the world, consumed by the loss of his son. But now, helping Jake and Ethan had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. One afternoon, after a meeting at the hospital, Charles decided to speak with Jake. He felt there was something important to say, something that went beyond the medical treatment. When he arrived at Ethan's room, Jake was sitting by his side, but upon seeing Charles enter, he stood up and stepped into the hallway to speak privately. "Charles," Jake said with a grateful smile, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." Charles looked at him, his expression serious but warm. "You don't need to thank me, Jake. What I've done for Ethan, I did because it felt right. But now I want to talk to you about something else." Jake frowned slightly, intrigued. "Since I started getting involved in your life and your brother's, I've been thinking about my own future as well," Charles continued, "and I think it's time you start thinking about yours." Jake nodded, but he wasn't sure what Charles was getting at. "I want to offer you a position at one of my companies," Charles said directly. "I know you've spent a lot of time fighting for your brother, and now that things are getting better, I want you to have the chance to build something for yourself too." Jake looked at him, surprised. He had never thought about his own future beyond day-to-day survival. His life had revolved entirely around Ethan, and the idea of having an opportunity for stability was something he hadn't considered. "I don't know what to say," Jake admitted, a mix of emotions and doubt in his voice. "I've never thought about working in a company." Charles smiled faintly. You don't have to decide right now. I just want you to know that you have options. What you've shown over all this time is that you're strong, hard-working, and responsible. Qualities any company would value. But beyond that, I want you to build a life that allows you to be happy, not just survive. Jake slowly nodded, feeling the weight of Charles's words. For the first time in a long time, he realized his life could be more than just a constant struggle. Later that day, Jake returned to Ethan's room. As his brother slept, he sat beside him, thinking about what Charles had said. The possibility of a different future, one where he wasn't just fighting to survive, but could build something more stable, was overwhelming but also exciting. As he was deep in thought, Emily entered the room, offering him a gentle smile, as if she could sense that something important was happening in Jake's mind. "Everything okay?" she asked, sitting next to him. Jake looked at her, his expression calm. "Yeah, for the first time in a long time, I think everything is starting to be okay." The hospital was now behind them, along with months of uncertainty, struggle, and sacrifice. Now outside, life felt lighter. Ethan, leaning on his cane, walked slowly through the park near his home, accompanied by Jake and Emily. Though his movements were still strained, there was a gleam in his eyes that spoke of newfound strength. Each step he took was a victory, and Jake couldn't help but feel immense pride in his brother's determination. "I'm not running a marathon yet," Ethan joked with a smile, "but I'll beat you in a race soon, Jake." Jake laughed as he walked beside him, knowing that Ethan's recovery was nothing short of a miracle. The illness was still present, lurking, but the progress was undeniable. The experimental treatment, funded by Charles, had made all the difference, but beyond the medicine, it was the love and support between them that had truly kept them going. Emily, walking alongside the brothers, felt like part of that strength. For months, she had stood by Jake and Ethan, and now that closeness had deepened into something much more meaningful. Every conversation, every shared laugh had cemented a connection that neither of them had anticipated. "Hey, Emily, maybe you should train with Ethan. You might actually stand a chance at beating me," Jake teased, winking. Emily smiled, enjoying the light-heartedness of the moment, but she knew that behind those words there was a deeper meaning. The dark days were fading, and with them, the weight of the despair that had followed them for so long. "We'll see who's the fastest," Emily replied, playing along, "but don't underestimate me, Jake Smith." That night, they all gathered at Emily's home for a dinner celebrating not only Ethan's recovery, but also the new chapter unfolding in their lives. Charles joined them, watching the brothers and his daughter with a mix of pride and gratitude. Though he could never erase the pain of losing his son, he knew that something within him had healed since he decided to help Jake and Ethan. His relationship with Emily, once fractured, was now beginning to mend. During dinner, the laughter and conversation flowed easily. Ethan, seated beside Charles, leaned over to him at one point. "I don't have words to thank you for what you've done for me, for us," Ethan said, his voice full of sincerity. Charles looked at him with a slight smile. "You don't owe me anything, Ethan. I did it because I wanted to, because you all have given me as much as I've given you. Maybe even more." Jake, who had overheard the conversation, felt a surge of emotion, seeing the bond that had formed between his family and Charles. He knew that without this man's intervention, their story could have ended very differently. Emily, watching her father interact with Ethan, felt a warmth in her chest. For the first time in a long while, there was peace between them. The emotional distance that had separated them for years now seemed smaller, and though not everything was resolved, there was hope for the future. After dinner, Jake and Emily stayed in the living room while Ethan and Charles continued talking in the kitchen. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated their faces, and the atmosphere was filled with a sense of tranquility. "It seems like everything's starting to fall into place," Jake said, breaking the silence. Emily looked at him with a smile. "Yes, I think we've all found something we needed, something we didn't even know we were searching for." Jake nodded, fully understanding what she meant. The path they had traveled had been hard, but the result was a deep network of connections that wouldn't have existed otherwise. "Emily," Jake began, a hint of hesitation in his voice. "I'm not sure how to say this, but I want you to know how important you are to me. Not just for what you've done for Ethan and me, but for how you make me feel. With you, everything feels easier. I feel like I can be myself." Emily looked at him, moved by his honesty. For a long time, she had felt like no one truly saw her for who she was. But with Jake, everything was different. "I feel the same way with you, Jake. I never thought I'd find this connection. But now that I have, I don't want to lose it." They both sat in silence for a moment, realizing that what had started as a simple collaboration during a crisis had turned into something deeper and more meaningful. It was no longer just about helping Ethan or dealing with the shadows of their own pasts. It was about building something together, a future where they could lean on each other. "So what's next for us?" Jake asked with a smile. Emily smiled back, taking his hand. "Whatever we want, the future is open, and I think together we can face it." Later that night, after everyone had said their goodbyes, Jake and Ethan returned to their small apartment. Though it had been a modest home, often filled with challenges, now it felt more full of hope than ever before. Ethan lay down on his bed, exhausted but happy. "I never thought I'd say this, but I think things are going to be okay," Ethan said, looking at his brother from the bed. "Not perfect, but okay." Jake smiled, turning off the lights and sitting on the edge of his brother's bed. "Yeah, Ethan, I think we're finally going to be okay." The Smith brothers, after months of struggle, had finally found a path toward stability and hope. With Emily's support and the new opportunity Charles had offered, Jake was ready to build a life beyond the hardships of the past. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to recover, surrounded by love and care. Together, they formed a family forged in adversity, but destined for a future full of possibilities. The future, though uncertain, was filled with hope for all of them. Thank you for joining us in this emotional story of sacrifice, hope, and new beginnings. Remember, sometimes the darkest moments lead us to the brightest destinations. If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video so more people can join this amazing community. Until next time, and always believe in second chances.